Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the office. You already know what we're talking about today because I did my production design and we have our photo right here. And yes, that is a Japanese movie. And yes, this is a Hong Kong Cinema channel. I will explain that in just 1 second. If you are new to the channel, thank you for finding us. I hope you like this video. I hope you like these movies. I hope you like these Blu-ray releases. I hope you find something enjoyable here. And if you do, if you could give us a sub and a thumbs up, it will be much appreciated. Thank you so much. Give us a comment too. I love comments. I love hopping in the comments section. It's kind of my favorite part of doing this. So why am I talking about this Japanese movie, which has been released by Eureka in the Masters of Cinema series? I have the Blu-ray right here, but also, just in case I'm not holding this up, you can see the artwork right there. This is Tony Stella artwork, by the way, which is, who did the slipcase for Undeclared War from Vinegar Syndrome, which is one of my favorite slipcases ever. The artwork on that is absolutely incredible. Fantastic artwork here too. This release has gotten a lot of interest, like in my Facebook group and people DMing me on Instagram asking me if I know anything about it, like when it was first announced and stuff like that. And a lot of people in the Hong Kong cinema community, and on Twitter too, actually. I'm on Twitter now, finally, not as the channel, Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society, but just as me. I'm at WWGish, so you can find me there. But kind of just people in general seem really interested in this release. And if you know anything about me, I lived in Japan. I lived in Tokyo. And my undergraduate degree is majored in art history. I minored in Japanese language and literature. So really what I was studying was Japanese art, history, culture, literature, movies, stuff like that. One of the first film studies classes I ever took was Japanese fiction and film, in which we read books and then watched the Japanese movies that were based on them. So we read like Japanese folktales, and we read novels, and we read short stories, and like we watched Rashomon and Ugetsu and Woman in the Dunes and Double Suicide and like all this kind of stuff. And so Japanese cinema is very near and dear to my heart, and this release was getting a lot of interest, so I thought, you know what, let's review it. So here it is. This is released in February 20th of 2023 by Eureka Entertainment. You have this amazing slipcase here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what this movie is about. It was directed by Hideo Gosha, who directed Three Outlast Samurai. He directed Sword of the Beast, I believe, which is a really fun movie. He directed Wolves, which is another Yakuza film, which is, I think, the film that he did directly before this film. He directed Goyokin and a bunch of other stuff. So if you're familiar with that era in Japanese cinema, he's a name you'll probably either have seen or you'll at least be aware of some of the films he's made, even if you haven't seen them. And then, let me give you a little bit about the plot in this movie. This is very much like a hard-boiled noir film. It is not like a John Woo style action movie with like shootouts everywhere and crazy stunts, and like it's very much a Japanese movie. It's not in the Hong Kong style of like over the top action, martial arts and stuff like that. It's a very hard boiled, gritty noir film. So the basic plot of it is you have the central character is this guy Egawa, who was in prison for stuff he did on behalf of the big Tokyo Yakuza family. And when he got out of prison, they gave him this bar in Ginza, which is like a central district in Tokyo. And it's kind of like a thank you for doing prison time and not complaining about it and not giving anybody up or anything like that. And so he's running this bar, and the Yakuza family comes to him, and it turns out the bar has become very important in this turf war between the Tokyo Yakuza and the Osaka Yakuza. So, like, we need the bar back. And he's kind of like, screw you. Like, this is my life now. Like, what am I going to do? So you have that conflict of the Yakuza family wants the bar back. You have the conflict. There's a lot of conflicts in this movie. The script of this movie is really, really well done. There's all these balls in the air, and it's handled so well in terms of the building of tension and the kind of constant piling up of these complications and these complex relationships between the characters. It's really well written film. And so you have that conflict of the family wants the bar back, the Yakuza family, and then you have the conflict of the Osaka family versus the Tokyo family. And then in the midst of all this, a Yakuza gang kidnaps a Japanese TV star whose career is basically funded and overseen by the Tokyo Yakuza. So that complicates things even more. So you have just all these complications piling up, and this guy Egawa is in the middle of everything. But you have all these amazing characters who have really strong like voices, but it really does remind me of like hard-boiled, I know I use that word a lot, noir films, and also Japanese films influenced by noir, like I mean Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, the Kurosawa films are the first ones that come to mind for me. But so if you're into that kind of like gritty, hard-edged, violent, brutal, kind of remorseless type of crime film, this is right up your alley. So that's kind of my nutshell review of this movie. I'm going to get kind of more into my thoughts on it and reviewing the release itself. Let me just show you the physical. So here we have this amazing slipcase, like I said, and this is in the Masters of Cinema line. And then you pop that off and you get that there, and then there is, and then I should also say that Eureka is almost entirely out of the limited first run of these that has the slipcase and the booklet. So if you're interested in that, get on it ASAP. And then you have kind of the inside there. It's interesting. It shows them on the streets of Tokyo. One thing that I noticed about this movie is that there's very little exciting location photography in Tokyo. It's a lot of it is filmed on sets or on location. I don't know if it's sets or location, but you're like inside for a lot of the movie, which again is very film noir, right? Like these old school Hollywood studio movies, they shot them in studios. So almost all of it is done in sets and in interiors and stuff like that. And this movie has that feeling of like there's a couple scenes where you're out on the street, but it's not really like the broader tapestry of the city is not really like an important part of this film. It's about these kind of like murky, smoky interiors where this violent stuff happens and there's all this conflict and stuff like that. So here we have, this guy's awesome. He's awesome. And there's a really good essay in here. I knew basically nothing about Hideo Gosha's life, even though I've seen several of his films. He was raised by like his uncle who was a gambler and kind of like a petty criminal, and then he signed up for the army, but he had a health problem, so he couldn't serve in the army. So then he was like trying to make a living like hand to mouth after the war, and he was like selling stolen U.S. military goods on the black market. Like he basically is like the low-level Yakuza dudes in this movie, and it was really, really cool to learn that. And there's a lot of information about the stars of the film and their careers and what kind of characters they used to play. So if you're new to, and this is a Toei film, so in Japan the studios had really distinct identities. That was true, I think, in the U.S. at one point. This is not really the case anymore. But, you know, like in Japan, you could say this is a Toho film, this is a Toei film, this is a Nikatsu film or whatever, and people would know what that meant. And this is very much like a post kind of battles for honor and humanity, Toei style Yakuza, like gangster crime film. So if you know what that means, you'll know exactly what you're getting into with this. This is also a very bloody and violent movie with lots of nudity and lots of sex. I'm honestly surprised it's a 15. I'm especially surprised it's a 15 when Magnificent Warriors I thought I saw was an 18, which is like not an objectionable movie at all. And this movie is like filled with like violence and weird sex and stuff like that. But it is what it is. So to give you my thoughts on this movie, like I said, the heavy, heavy film noir influence. I see so many, you know, like the Kurosawa film noir stuff, but also like the stuff like Key Largo and like those old Hollywood movies. And there's even a scene where a guy's got like a revolver. He's doing like the pow, 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 like the cowboy thing. And you see some like a little bit of like old Western, spaghetti Western type of influence in this movie too. But the other thing that's really interesting about this movie is that while it is very much a gangster Yakuza film of the 1970s, and it is influenced by noir, I see influence from the Japanese New Wave in here too. So the Japanese New Wave was something that was happening like late 60s into the 70s. It was inspired by a lot of the French New Wave films, which was this generation of filmmakers who wanted to move away from like classical filmmaking, studio style filmmaking, to do kind of more European style stuff, to do self-aware, kind of meta, self-reflexive, heavily metaphorical counterculture type of films, right? This movie has this really fascinating ongoing thing where within the film, you have the plot, right? Separate from the plot, through the visuals, through the locations, through the just kind of the stuff that people are doing, there's this whole strain of like thematic, almost like philosophical inquisition into the nature of like the spectacle of sex and violence. Let me get our screen going again here. Of like, oh, never mind. Our production design is done. You can look at these bright colors if you want. Should I sign back in? Should I take a second to sign back in? Let's do it. Don't look at my password. So what I'm talking about here is like voyeurism. There's even a scene where, and this is not really a spoiler, there's a scene where a guy in the movie he knows that this guy is going to go on a killing rampage. And he basically says, like, do you mind if I come with you and just watch? And he just sits, I'm not kidding you. He sits in the back of the car and just watches this guy go around killing people. And it's completely insane. And that's like, it's this very, very, okay, this is just like, I've really messed this up here. Let's go to view. Let's go to full screen. Bada bing, bada boom. I probably should have attended to that before I started making this video, making sure that it wouldn't go dark on us, but it is what it is. Everything is going off the rails. But, I mean, there's another really fascinating scene that I think really speaks volumes as to this kind of simmering background theme of the spectacle of sex, the way that selling sex and violence makes it desirable, so makes people go out and do it or want it and covet it, which creates desperation and acts of violence and criminality and stuff like that. It's like this, the way that the media and sensationalism, and so let me give you another example of this. The television star who gets kidnapped, right? These guys are holding her hostage, and there's a scene where one of the hostage takers is being very nice to her. He's like, do you want something to eat? Like, here, have an apple. Are you hungry? And then she comes on the TV, and he looks at her on the TV, and he looks at her in real life, and he's like, oh my God, that's her. Like, she's right here, right in front of me. I can do whatever I want to her. And he gets really creepy with her and very like handsy and like, and you see in his eyes this dawning of like, here is this sex symbol, this celebrity who everyone would love to be around or to spend time with, to talk to. And I have her tied up in this room right now. And again, you see these scenes of like, there are frequent scenes that take place in places where they're doing like either sex shows or like sexually suggestive performances. Like there's one where there's these two people dressed up as like geishas who are like simulating sex on a stage. There's a striptease scene. Well, there's multiple striptease scenes actually. There's one scene where a guy is having a threesome while watching porn videos, right? So there's all of these layers of like meta kind of devices of like seeing something and being the voyeur, being the spectator of both sex and violence, but then of desiring it because it's presented to you. And I think that plays into Yakuza too, and this idea of, you know, the glamorization of violence. And there's even a scene where the Yakuza are having this meeting about funding the career of this TV star who's kidnapped, and it's like peeling the layers of the onions. Here's the sex symbol that we're selling you. Behind that is this lurid violence and shady business dealings and drug dealing and all this crap. And they create all these layers of this network of glamorization and desire that compel people to do these horrible things and get in these horrible situations. And it's this very kind of self-aware, again, it really reminded me of the Japanese New Wave. If you've ever seen the film Double Suicide does this fascinating thing where it takes like the conventions of bunraku, Japanese puppet theater, and it turns it into like a art house film where there are literally puppeteers moving the characters around in the scenes and like changing the scenery in the background. It's crazy. That movie is crazy. But I just think it's this really interesting kind of meta device of examining what the film is about. So it's like a very good Yakuza crime film, but it's also this really interesting examination of the conventions thereof and what that means. Something else I really love to geek out about is post-war Japanese history. This is like my favorite era in the history of the world. And I've read like several books about post-war Japanese history. I studied it when I was in college, obviously, because I told you about what my degree was in. And I love that era in Japanese cinema. And so I've studied a lot of the history kind of around that era to see what was going on around the films in a way, right? And this movie, there's something so fascinating in this movie where the Tokyo Yakuza family is trying to go legit. Like they're trying to become a 100% legitimate business with no illegal dealings at all. And their goal is to control the Japanese economy. And if you study the history of these Yakuza groups after the war, they began like in the black markets. And then as the economy of Japan exploded, they became kind of inextricably intertwined with like banks, the government, legitimate corporations, but while also being these criminal enterprises. And then eventually they became actual legitimate corporations with offices, with like all this stuff, right? And they had huge influence on politics. They had huge influence on the banking system and all of these other things. And this movie takes this really interesting look at, there's a really great shot where they're in a helicopter and you see these kind of skyscraper buildings going up, and these Yakuza guys are talking about controlling the economy and the kind of the post-war Japanese economic miracle and the power of Japan's economy in the world at that time, and what we know would happen with the power of Japan's economy over the next decade and a half, about before the bubble popped. It's a really interesting look at that world and that time. The one other thing I will say about this movie before I tell you about the bonus features, I swear I will stop rabbiting on, is Masaru Sato did the score for this movie. And Masaru Sato is one of my two favorite film composers ever. It's Masaru Sato and Toru Takemitsu. They're absolutely hands down my favorites. Masaru Sato worked a lot with Kurosawa after Fumio Hayasaka passed away, who was Kurosawa's, the guy who originally did all Kurosawa's scores. I love Masaru Sato's music. It is so good, and the music in this movie is freaking fantastic. Okay, so there's a Tony Raines feature on here that's 37 minutes long, and it's Tony Raines just kind of talking about the movie. And this is really, really cool, especially if you don't know that much about the history of the Japanese film industry. He begins kind of in the 1930s, and he talks about the Japanese government consolidating and nationalizing all the film production companies into these studios, and that's essentially what created the Japanese studio system. And they were rationing film stock at the time because of the war. He talks about how like the actors' contracts were working, like you're with this company, but now we're rolling you into this studio, and your contract will be with this. Like, it's really fascinating. And he talks about the formation of Toei, which is the studio that put this film out. Toei was not one of those companies that was around during the war. They were a new company after the war. He talks about Hideo Gosha and his career, his life. He talks about the post-war Yakuza, much like I just geeked out about that. He analyzes the film a little bit. He talks about the story. He talks about implausible elements within the story, like, oh, if you know anything about Japanese history or the way that the Yakuza works, then this scene won't make a lot of sense to you, like that kind of stuff. It's very fascinating. And then you have a video essay. And let me tell you the name of that video essay. It's about 13 minutes long, and it's called Fighting in the Streets, a video essay by writer and filmmaker Jasper Sharp. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this video essay is there's a pretty substantial section of it that's about Wolves, which was Hideo Gosha's film that came out before Violent Streets. And it was for a different studio. I think it was for Toho, and it was like a much bigger, longer, more lavish kind of period piece film. And in the video essay, there's a lot of discussion about that movie, how it differs from this movie, how Gosha went from that movie to this movie, the kind of the state of the film industry at the time. If you know anything about the Japanese studio system, it essentially collapsed when television became insanely popular. I guess that would be the late 60s it would really be into the 70s, when everyone had a TV in their house and everyone was watching TV, and there were all these hugely popular TV shows, and everyone was just moving into the TV industry, and the studio system kind of fell apart. But you had these people, like Toei was putting out these types of films, and you had the monster films, like the kaiju films and stuff like that, that were kind of keeping the film industry going. And so that's a really interesting kind of breakdown and analysis there, but it's a really good video essay. So the release here is Violent Streets. I do thank you for allowing me to geek out about a Japanese film on a Hong Kong cinema channel. I was just so excited this came out. It's so exciting for me to be able to just sit down and watch like a classic Japanese movie and just really enjoy it and like take my time with it and go through the bonus features, and like, because I watch so many Hong Kong movies. I watch very few Japanese movies these days. And there was a period in my life, maybe like 10 or so years ago, when I was watching mostly Japanese movies. And so it's really great to like revisit it and to feel the rhythms of Japanese cinema, the music, the visuals. It was a really great experience for me. And if you're new to Japanese cinema, especially Yakuza films, I think this would be a really good kind of entry point for you. So my name is Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. It's Eureka. It's Violent Streets. It's Hideo Gosha. I thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.